All right, well, we're back and we're going to have to record and upload now. So let me just redo this lesson a little bit and maybe this will work better. Psalm chapter 6, we're looking at David's correction here. And so David is praying again to God as he continuously does. And when we read through the Psalms, we are seeing David and we are seeing a man who is a man after God's own heart. And you can see the prayers and you can see the way that he speaks to God. And it ought to help us to formulate our prayer lives and think about being a person after God's own heart as well. And so this psalm is really a cry for help. He's in a desperate time of need. And so he's crying out to God. The desperation that he cries out from seems that David is in sin or has sinned, and his sin has found him out, and now he is suffering as a result of the sin. He's viewing his physical situation, his sickness or his affliction that has come upon him from sin, and he views it as a judgment from God. So this psalm presents to us the first of 7 psalms in the book of Psalms that we would call the penitential psalms. So we don't know what the sickness is or what the affliction is that David's going through, but we do know that it is very extreme, and he may be right on the edge or the precipice of dying. And so he's crying out to the Lord to keep him from death and to restore him from the guilt that he's facing. And so in this, all of his enemies have surrounded him, or they are using this as an opportunity to sort of kick him while he's down. And they have been very vicious in this and causing him to shed many tears. They've really become something to him that is discouraging in a large way. So discouragement and sickness, and then the hate mail or the threats of enemies, they really just create a big problem. And that's what prompts this prayer here in Psalm chapter 6 that we're looking at. And I want you to see 4 parts in this psalm. You see David's cry, verses 1 through 3, David's conclusion to his circumstances in verse 4 and 5, David's condition is brought out in verse 6 and 7, and then lastly, David's confidence. We see that verses 8 through 10. So let's begin by looking first at David's cry, verses 1 through 3. Verse 1, David begins here, O Lord, do not rebuke me in your anger, nor chasten me in your wrath. David is being rebuked. He's being chastened by God. He's being corrected. He's being disciplined. But he doesn't want God to rebuke him in his anger or his wrath, which seems to imply that if God does rebuke him in his anger and wrath, that he will not live. He will come to nothing and no longer be living. We gather that from some other verses in Psalm. In Psalm 118, verse 18, the Lord has disciplined me severely, but he has not given me over to death. So there's been severe discipline, but it's not yet ended in death. Jeremiah 10:24 says, correct me, O Lord, but with justice, not with your anger, or you will bring me to nothing. You know, if God rises up in anger, if God uses wrath, and it becomes a part of what is factored into the discipline that he exhibits for us, it will bring us to nothing. And David recognizes that, and he prays that God would not deal with him in that manner. So nonetheless, a severe discipline, but please, Lord, hold back your anger and your wrath. And we know that God is slow to anger, and he is relenting concerning wrath, especially for those who are penitent, which we see David bringing out here, a prayer for restoration through penitence, a penitent heart. So whatever painful sickness he's facing, he certainly learned from it and is now pleading that God would remove all of this. Second, in verse 2, he says, be gracious to me, O Lord, for I'm pining away. Heal me, O Lord, for my bones are dismayed. You know, to be gracious, he wants God to be favorable to him, merciful, compassionate, kind. He's wanting God to show him favor. And so he says, be gracious to me. I'm pining away. That term pining away means he's withering away. He's drying up. He is dwindling away. It's getting worse. And so he's asking God to heal him from this sickness, from the physical malady that he is going through. As severe as it is, he wants God to heal. He says his bones are dismayed. And you see in Psalm 41, verse 4, as for me, I said, O Lord, be gracious to me. Heal my soul, for I have sinned against you. So there, a prayer for God's grace, a prayer for healing because of sin against God. That seems to be what is going on here. He's praying for God's grace, he's praying for God's healing, and it is because it seems as of his sin. Hosea 6:1 says, come, let us return to the Lord. Let's return to the Lord, for he has torn us, but he will heal us. He has wounded us, but he will bandage us. Yes, when we go astray from God, God will wound, God will tear, but he can also heal and he can bandage. God can restore us if we will turn back to the Lord. David is certainly turning to the Lord in prayer. He says that his bones are dismayed. Seems to be a figure that stands for his whole body. In Psalm 31:10, he says, for my life is spent with sorrow and my years with sighing. My strength has failed because of my iniquity, and my body has wasted away. The term there, body, could be bones. The margin says bones or substance. So he's referring to his whole body, his whole physical essence. He is wasting away. It's just getting worse. And so sorrow and sighing and all because of iniquity. He's wasting away. Look at what sin does to us. Physically, we waste away. It literally just deteriorates us when we engage in sin. It takes its toll on the body. And so David's pleading with God to heal the body, relieve the physical illness that he's suffering as a result of sin. And he says that he's pining away or withering. And in verse 3, he says, my soul is greatly dismayed, but you, O Lord, how long? David, he says his soul, that's his life. His life is greatly troubled. Not just troubled, greatly troubled. He is going through something very severe. And so he's asking God, how long will you remain distant? How long will you cause this to go on? When you think about his soul being greatly dismayed, I think about Psalm 88:3, where he says, my soul has had enough troubles, and my life has drawn near to Sheol. You know, when your life has had so many great troubles, it seems that death is only the next thing. It is what is looming as being the ultimate end to all the troubles. In John 12:27, Jesus mentioned, my soul has become troubled. And what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. For this purpose I came to this hour. Jesus says, my soul is troubled and death is on the horizon. He knew what was coming. And here David is praying, and his soul is greatly troubled, greatly dismayed. So he says, but you, Lord, how long? How long, Lord, will you remain distant? How long will you allow me to continue withering away? How long will you hold back your mercy and your grace from me? And so David is seeking God to step in. And so we see his cry. Look at David's conclusion in verse 4 and 5. David's conclusion to the way he is seeing his life. And he says here, return, O Lord, rescue my soul. Save me because of your loving kindness. And so you notice he's asking God to return, which is a picture that God has left. God has abandoned him or forsaken him. Jesus said, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, is my God, why have you forsaken me? Which is, he has abandoned him. And God abandoned his son while he was on the cross because he was taking on the sins of the world. And this is what happens when we sin. There's nothing worse than sinning, because that causes God to abandon us. It causes him to forsake us. He cannot look upon sin. He cannot have fellowship with sin. He is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. So when we sin, we must become penitent. We must cry out to God. Otherwise, we remain distant. We create separation between us and God. And he says, "Oh Lord, rescue my soul. Save me because of your loving kindness." He wants to be rescued. He wants to be saved. It sounds like somebody out to sea who's lost at sea in the midst of the deep, dark waters. And he's looking for a rescue, looking for someone to save him out of the angry waves. And here he says, "God, because of your loving kindness, I want you to save me. Save me because of who you are, because of your character." Oftentimes in the Old Testament, you would see Moses and others crying out to God to do something for his people or for them individually, and they will say, "Because of your loving kindness, because of who you are, God, and because of your promises and your faithfulness and your covenant that you've made." And so here the same is true. He's crying out to God to rescue him and save him and return to him because of his loving kindness. He says, "There's no mention of you in death. In Sheol, who will give you thanks?" Notice he starts verse 5 with the word "for," which connects it to verse 4. So he's saying, "I want you to return to me and save me and rescue me, because who's going to mention you in death? I can't mention you in death. I can't give you thanks when I get to the grave, which is Sheol." And so he's basically telling God, "I'm going to continue speaking for you. I'm going to thank you. I'm going to be your servant. I'm going to be faithful if I get through this." It's sort of his plan. His conclusion is, I'll be your servant on this earth and continue doing your will. So he's asking God, according to his loving kindness, to help him through this, and that he would continue to speak for God and give him thanks. So we see David's conclusion of his life. If he is spared from this, he's going to become a servant of God and continue doing God's will. Next, you see David's condition. Look at verse 6 and 7. "I'm weary with my sighing. Every night I make my bed swim. I dissolve my couch with tears." David's weary. David's tired. David is worn out because of all the sighing and groaning and going through these difficulties. It's causing him to wear out. I don't know that we've maybe been through this much, but maybe you have. But David has really gone through a lot, and so he's just wore out. He's wore out from it. He says, "Every night I make my bed swim. I dissolve my couch with tears." You hear the poetic exaggeration in these verses. He's talking about causing his bed to swim. You ever seen Alice in Wonderland, where she cries so much she starts swimming around in her tears? This is a graphic picture of exaggeration, but David is saying he's just crying all the time. He mentions that this is something that happens every night. Every night when it's quiet, he's alone with his own thoughts, he's right back in the same boat, crying, crying, and crying. He's on his bed, he's on his couch. It's just always sobbing before the Lord. And notice in verse 7, he says, "My eye has wasted away with grief. It has become old because of my adversaries." David, why are you so filled with grief? Why is all this happening? He says, "Because my adversaries." His adversaries have apparently been able to gain some upper hand on him. Maybe they're adding some criticisms to him or taunting him, hoping that it gets worse, telling him God's no longer with him. You can imagine all of the mean and hateful things that someone might say to someone when they're down that would make it just all the more worse. And so here David is going through this, and he says that it's causing his eye to waste away with grief and become old or weak. So his adversaries are involved in this. So here's David's condition. He is distraught. He is tired. He's worn out, and he's always groaning about this to God. So the enemies seem to have gained an upper hand, and this is one of the things we can expect from sin. When we get involved in sin, a lot of the times God allows our enemies, our opponents, to kind of gain access to our life. You remember nationally with Israel, when they would engage in sin, God would take the hedge of protection down from what he called Israel, his vineyard, and they would be able to come in and pick the grapes, and they would come in and trample it, and there would just be people able to gain an upper hand on God's people. As God's people, when we engage in sin, the enemy then gains access to cause us more pain, more grief, and more trouble. And so David's prayer of penitence leads him to this situation. Now we see David's confidence. Lastly, in verses 8 through 10, David says, "Depart from me, all you who do iniquity, for the Lord has heard the voice of my weeping." Notice the change of tone as he comes in saying, "Depart from me, all you who do iniquity. Get away from me. Get back. You better go somewhere." What's the idea here? Well, he's confident about the fact that he has truly poured out a heartfelt prayer of penitence and cried out to God, and he believes God has heard that prayer because he knows God. And he has been weeping. And he says that the Lord has heard the voice of my weeping. You know, God listens to those who weep, those who are filled with godly sorrow. And they begin to turn from joy to mourning and from from frivolity to gloom, as James 4 tells us that we need to turn our laughter into mourning and our joy into gloom. We need to come before the Lord and humble ourselves and cry out to him, and you see he listens to the voice of weeping. It's very fascinating. And so you remember in Psalm 51:17, he says, "A broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise." God does not despise that broken and contrite heart, which is what we need when we get involved in sin. It's exactly what God will accept. So he's a man after God's own heart, and he brings a penitence to God. Verse 9, he says, "The Lord has heard my supplication. The Lord receives my prayer." Notice all these phrases in verse 8 and 9. He's heard the voice of my weeping. He has heard my supplications, and he receives my prayer. And so all three of these combine to express David's faith in the fact that God hears penitent prayers, heartfelt sorrow and grief over sin, and he knows it. And he knows that God is gracious, and he knows that God is filled with loving kindness, and so he knows that God received his prayer, because that is what God said he would receive, and that is what David gave to God. So there should be no doubt when we are going according to what God has said he will do. And so this turns from a deep cry of distress into a confident cry of faith. And lastly, verse 10, he says, "All my enemies will be ashamed and greatly dismayed. They shall turn back. They will suddenly be ashamed." So twice he mentions his enemies are going to be ashamed. It's going to happen suddenly. It's going to be all of a sudden when God decides to act, when this thing is lifted. How long, O Lord? How long will this go on? But when God finally does lift this off of David and restore him back and save him out of the circumstances he's in, then his enemies will suddenly be ashamed. They're going to be completely embarrassed. And he says they're going to be greatly dismayed, and they're going to be turning back. They're going to be on the run, and they're going to be greatly troubled because of God hearing David's prayer for help. And so these enemies will not be able to have the upper hand once God restores David. David understands how this works. He understands that once God steps in and restores the penitent sinner, that he will begin to push the hedge back up and push the enemies back out. And we can have the same confidence in our lives that those troubles that are a result of sin, we can remove those through a penitent cry to God for help and continuing to have confidence in him keeping his word. I want you to consider just a couple of things from this psalm as we begin to close here. Number one, I want you to consider the impact that sin can have in our lives. It impacts us physically for sure. Our physical bodies are impacted, and sometimes we see that sin brings forth these things. You see that in Scripture, but not always. Sometimes we suffer physically as a result of having our faith tested, or other things. It may not be as a result of sin. We see that with Job. Job didn't get engaged in sin, but yet he still suffered, and he didn't know why. And so there's a lot of times, though, when we are sinning, and as children of God, God disciplines us. And so he allows us to go through various difficulties because of the sin in our lives that we've not been penitent about. We've not become miserable over and pained by, to the point where it's caused us to go to God and allow him to hear the voice of our weeping. And not only will sin destroy us physically, it can destroy us emotionally. David was swimming in tears. He was very distraught. He was constantly crying, very upset He was discouraged, he was heartbroken over what he had done and the situation that he had found himself in as a result of sinning against God. And so we will end up in the same place when we decide to choose sin. We end up separating ourselves from God and piercing ourselves with many griefs. And it can affect us relationally. That hedge of protection can be taken down, and the once safe relationship we had from our enemies now becomes a very threatening and very serious one. And so it is costly to get involved with sin. But I want you to also consider this: God's loving kindness and the power of a penitent prayer. God's promise that he would not despise a prayer that comes from a broken and contrite heart. And so that's what we see David bringing forth here, is a broken and contrite heart. And this psalm illustrates to us that we need to pray when we're hurting because of our sinfulness, when we are suffering because we have chosen sin over God. Then we need to come to God with a heartfelt prayer, and we need to allow him to hear our supplications and the cry of our heart. And so we can be confident when we come to God in humble penitence with a contrite heart that he will hear us and that he will receive our prayer and restore us from the difficult circumstances we have placed ourselves in. This is David's prayer in Psalm chapter 6, in a circumstance in his life where sin had found him out, where his sufferings were real, and yet he knew God well enough to know that he could pray and he could ask God for things that were in accordance with his will, and then confidence kicked in at the end, and he knew that God received his prayer and that his enemies would soon be on the run. We can have the same confidence when we know God. Let us continue to be penitent when we sin, that we can find God's favor and mercy again in time of need.